Mom, who's the boy that Daddy was holding hands with at the store yesterday? My 8-year-old daughter Eliza asked me this on a Sunday morning in March, over a bowl of cinnamon oatmeal, in the same calm tone she might have used to ask whether we were out of orange juice. She was looking at the cartoon on her cereal box. Her younger brother Theo, who was 5, was drawing a dinosaur on the back of an envelope. My husband Mark was upstairs in the shower. The kitchen was full of the small, ordinary sounds of a Vermont Sunday morning. The radiator, the coffee machine, a car going past on Spring Street. Eliza ate another bite of oatmeal, and I stood at the kitchen counter holding a mug of coffee that I no longer remembered pouring, and I felt the floor of my life shift 1 degree to the left. I said, in the voice I have used my entire life when I have decided to be calm, "What boy, sweetheart?" Eliza shrugged. She said, "The one at the mall. When we were getting Theo's shoes." Daddy was holding his hand. He was a kind of grown-up boy. Like a big boy, but big. She thought about it for a second and said, "Is he Daddy's friend?" I was at the grocery store with the kids the day before. Mark had told me he was working at the office. The mall is across the parking lot from the grocery store. We had not gone to the mall. We had not gone anywhere near the mall. I had pulled into the grocery store parking lot at 4 in the afternoon, and Eliza, who had been looking out the back window at the world the way 8-year-olds look at the world, with full attention and no agenda, must have seen something walk by in the corner of her vision that her brain had filed under interesting. I said, "I bet that was just a friend of Daddy's, honey. Eat your breakfast." Eliza nodded and went back to the cereal box. Theo asked me to spell Stegosaurus. I spelled Stegosaurus. Mark came down the stairs in clean jeans and a flannel shirt, smelling of soap, and kissed the top of my head and asked what was for breakfast. And I poured him a cup of coffee, and I smiled at him, and I did not look at his face for longer than 2 seconds, because I was afraid that he would see in my face what had just happened in mine. My name is Diane Holloway. I am 41 years old. I am a school librarian at a public elementary school in Burlington, Vermont. I have been married to Mark for 12 years. This is a story about the question my daughter asked me at the breakfast table, and about the place I drove to 4 days later, and about the conversation Mark and I had on a Thursday night in March that took a marriage I had thought I understood and showed me, very gently, all the rooms I had not known were in it. Let me tell you about Mark, because this story does not make sense unless you understand what kind of man I thought I had married. Mark Holloway grew up in a small town in upstate New York, the older of 2 brothers in what he had always described to me as a complicated family. His mother had died of a stroke when he was 19, and his brother was 13. His father had been, by Mark's account, an alcoholic who had grown harder after the mother died, and who had died himself of liver failure 6 years before Mark and I met. Mark had told me, on our 3rd date, in a small Italian restaurant on Church Street, that his younger brother Stephen had died of a drug overdose at 25. He had told me this with downcast eyes and a quiet voice. He had said, "I don't talk about it much. There's nothing to say. I tried. I couldn't help him." I had reached across the table and held his hand. I had thought, in the way you think on 3rd dates that turn into marriages, that I had just been trusted with the central pain of a good man's life. Mark is, by every measure I know how to use, a good husband. He is a senior accountant at a regional firm. He is steady, gentle, present, the kind of father who knows the names of all his children's stuffed animals. He is not the kind of man who keeps secrets. He is the kind of man who tells you which client annoyed him at lunch, and what he had for breakfast, and how much sleep he got. For 12 years, the texture of our marriage had been one of small, daily honesty. Except, apparently, in one specific place. Except, apparently, in a small 2-story residence on Maple Lane on the south side of Burlington, where a man named Stephen Holloway, age 38, had been living since 2009. I did not say anything to Mark that Sunday. I want to tell you why, because I think this is one of the parts of the story that matters. I am a librarian. I am a person who looks things up before she draws conclusions. The thought my brain wanted to go to, in the first 5 minutes, was the obvious one, that Mark had a child I did not know about. A son. From before me. From an earlier life. I had a very brief, very specific vision of my husband walking through a mall, holding the hand of a teenage boy who was somehow his. I let myself feel that for about 20 seconds, and then I made myself stop, because Eliza had said, "A kind of grown-up boy, like a big boy but big." 8-year-olds are not always articulate, but they are usually accurate. Whatever she had seen, it had not been a teenager. It had been an adult who, to her eye, moved like a child. I spent the next 3 days noticing things. I noticed that Mark, on Monday evening, mentioned that he might need to work late on Thursday. He had been mentioning this every other Thursday for as long as we had been married. I had never thought about it. Thursdays were always slightly long. I had never asked him what about Thursdays. I had assumed there was a meeting. There had always been a meeting. I noticed that, on Tuesday, Mark went to the bank during his lunch hour. He came home with a small envelope of cash that he put in his coat pocket. I had never seen him do that before, in the sense that I had never noticed him doing it. I now realized that I noticed it now because I was looking. Mark had been doing things for 12 years that I had not been looking at. On Wednesday night, after the kids were in bed, I went to Mark's home office and I sat at his desk for an hour. I did not open anything. I did not look at any papers. I just sat in his chair and looked at the room and tried to see it the way a stranger would. There was a small framed photograph on the bookshelf I had never really looked at, a picture of Mark at about 8 years old with a smaller boy of maybe 2 on his lap. I had always assumed the smaller boy was a cousin because Mark's brother was, in my understanding, dead, and I did not look closely at photographs of dead brothers. I looked closely that night. The smaller boy had Mark's eyes. The smaller boy was Stephen. I left the office. I closed the door. I did not cry. I went downstairs and made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at the kitchen island, and I made a plan. I would follow Mark on Thursday. I would not confront him. I would simply find out where he went on alternating Thursdays in the late afternoon, and then I would decide what to do. Thursday came. I took a half day from school. I told my principal I had a doctor's appointment. I drove my car to a parking lot 2 blocks from Mark's office, and I sat in the back row, where his window did not face, and I waited. Mark came out of the office at 3:30. He got in his car. He drove south through the city. I followed him at 2 cars back, the way you do in movies, which is to say badly. I lost him twice. I picked him up again. He pulled into a residential street I had never been on. He parked in front of a small 2-story house with a wraparound porch and a green and white sign by the front walkway that read, "Maple Lane Residence, a home for adults with cognitive and behavioral health needs." I parked half a block back, on the opposite side of the street, and I sat in my car and I watched. Mark went inside. He did not knock. He had a key. He walked up the porch steps and unlocked the door the way you unlock a door you have been unlocking for 14 years. He went in. He was inside for about an hour. I sat in my car the entire hour. I did not move. I did not call anyone. I watched the front door of a small, clean residential facility in the south end of my own city, where my husband apparently had a key. At 4:45, Mark came out, holding the hand of a tall, thin man in a blue jacket. The man was about Mark's height. He was thin. He had Mark's eyes. He moved with the small, careful gait of a person who has been on certain medications for a long time. Mark led him gently down the porch steps and walked him in a slow, looping circle around the small front yard. The man pointed at a bird in a tree. Mark looked at the bird. The man laughed at something Mark said. Mark put his arm around the man's shoulders for a second, then let it fall. I sat in my car and I cried for the first time. I did not cry from anger. I cried because my husband, in 12 years of marriage, had never once allowed me to see his face do what it was doing right now. Mark was being a brother. The face was different. I had not known he had this face. I had been married to him for 12 years, and there was a face he had been wearing every other Thursday at 4:30 that I had not known existed. After Mark left at 5:15, I waited 5 more minutes. Then I walked up the porch steps and rang the doorbell. A woman in her 50s opened the door, wearing a name tag that said Patricia, Lead Care Coordinator. She looked at me with a polite question. I said, I am Mark Holloway's wife. I'm Diane. I believe my husband was just here visiting his brother Stephen. Patricia's face did a small, careful thing. The kind of thing the face does when a person who has been protecting someone's privacy for 14 years is suddenly looking at a different part of that person's life walking through the front door. She said, very gently, "Mrs. Holloway, would you like to come inside?" I sat in a small office that smelled like coffee and disinfectant. Patricia did not tell me anything specific. She told me that she was bound by privacy laws and that she could not confirm or deny anything about a specific resident without consent. But she also told me, in the careful, indirect way of a person who has decided to be a witness, that Mark Holloway was a beloved and devoted member of this resident's chosen family. She said, "He has been here every other Thursday since this resident moved in. He pays a significant portion of the resident's care costs. He is, in the eyes of this facility, the resident's primary family." She watched me as she said it. She let me sit with it. I asked her one question. I said, "Is Stephen happy here?" Patricia smiled then, the first real smile of the conversation. She said, "Mrs. Holloway, he is one of our most beloved residents. He is a kind, gentle, observant man. He paints. He has a vegetable garden. He volunteers at the local elementary school once a week, reading to the kindergartners. He has a full life. Your husband has built that for him over a very long time." I asked her if I could leave my name and phone number. I told her that whenever Stephen was ready, and whenever Mark was ready, I would like to meet him. Patricia wrote down my number on a card. She put it in her desk drawer. She said, "I am very glad you came." I drove home. I picked up the kids from after-school care. I made them macaroni and cheese with broccoli. I helped Theo with a worksheet about ladybugs. I read Eliza a chapter of the Roald Dahl book we were working through. I put them to bed at 8:30. I sat in the kitchen and waited for Mark to come home. Mark came in at 9. He was tired. He had taken Stephen for ice cream after their walk, the way he always did on Thursdays. I knew this now because Patricia had told me. He kissed my forehead. He asked if the kids were asleep. I said yes. I said, "Mark, sit down. I need to tell you something." He sat down at the kitchen table. I sat across from him. I had practiced this in my head for 4 hours. I said, "I went to Maple Lane today. I met Patricia. I sat in her office for 30 minutes. I know about Stephen. I want to tell you everything I know before you say anything so that you don't have to lie about anything tonight. You don't have to choose what to tell me. I already know." I told him what I knew. The years of every other Thursday, the financial transfers, the photograph on the bookshelf I had finally looked at, the mall the previous Saturday, Eliza's question at breakfast, the decision to follow him today, the parking lot, the porch, the walk in the front yard, the arm around Stephen's shoulders, Patricia's office. Mark did not speak for a full minute. He did not cry. He did not defend himself. He sat at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the wood, and he looked at me, and I watched 12 years of carefully maintained architecture come down inside him in slow motion. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. He said, "Diane, I am so sorry. I have wanted to tell you for 12 years. I said, "Then why didn't you?" He told me, that night, in fragments, the story I had been married to and had not known. He told me that his father, who had died 6 years before Mark and I met, had been a violent and ashamed man. He told me that Stephen had been diagnosed at 15, after their mother died, with a combination of conditions that I will not name here because they were Stephen's to name, and that his father had refused to accept the diagnoses, had refused treatment for him for 2 years, had hid him, had told him he was disgracing the family, had, in one specific incident Mark did not give me the details of, only the shape, done something to Stephen that ended in a hospital visit and 3 months of legal custody concerns. Mark, who was a senior in college at the time, had come home and had become Stephen's primary support person from the age of 21. He had been Stephen's main person for the next 17 years. When he was 28, 3 years before we met, Mark's father had died. The will had left a small inheritance to Mark, contingent on what the will called appropriate placement of Stephen. The will had also contained a sentence that Mark, when he repeated it to me that night at the kitchen table, could still recite from memory. The sentence had been, "And let it be understood that the family shame that is Stephen Holloway is not to be carried into the families our son Mark may yet build. The boy's burden is to be discharged through professional care, not paraded as kin." Mark looked at me across the table and said, "I read that sentence at 28, Diane, alone in a lawyer's office in Buffalo, and I made a decision about my future life that I am not proud of and that I have been paying for ever since. I decided to use the money my father left for Stephen's care the way he wanted, and I decided to honor the rest of my father's wish for the wrong reason. I told myself I was protecting whoever I would eventually marry from the burden my father had been ashamed of. I was actually protecting myself from finding out whether the woman I married could love a man with a brother my father had taught me to be ashamed of. I told you Stephen was dead because by then I had been telling that lie to people for 3 years, and I had forgotten how to do anything else. I am so sorry. I am so deeply, deeply sorry. I did not know how to start telling you. I never figured out how to start." We talked until 2 in the morning. We talked at the kitchen table, and then on the back porch, and then in our bed with the door closed. Mark told me everything. I asked questions. I did not raise my voice. I cried, but quietly, the way you cry when you are reorganizing a life and you do not want to wake the children. Mark cried more. He cried like a man who has been carrying a weight for 14 years and is, finally, in a room where someone has agreed to help him hold it. I met Stephen the following Sunday. Mark drove me to Maple Lane. Patricia was there. Stephen had been told that morning, gently, by Mark himself, that he had a sister-in-law named Diane and that she was coming to meet him. Stephen had asked Mark several questions. He had asked whether Diane was nice. Mark had said yes. He had asked whether she had brown hair or blonde hair. Mark had said brown. He had asked whether she would like the painting he had done last week of a cardinal. Mark had said he was certain she would. I walked into the small common room at Maple Lane on a Sunday afternoon in late March, and a tall, thin man in a blue cardigan stood up from a chair near the window and waited. He did not come forward. He waited, the way Patricia had warned me he might, because new people were sometimes hard. Mark walked me over. Mark said, "Stephen, this is Diane. She is my wife. She has wanted to meet you for a long time." Stephen looked at me carefully. His eyes were Mark's eyes. He said, "Hello, Diane. I made you a card." He held it out. It was a piece of construction paper folded in half. On the front was a careful pencil drawing of a cardinal on a branch. Inside, in slow, careful handwriting, it said, "Welcome to my family, Stephen Holloway." I sat down with Stephen at a small round table by the window. We talked for an hour. He showed me his vegetable garden through the window. He told me he was growing tomatoes this year for the first time. He told me he liked oatmeal raisin cookies, but not chocolate chip. He told me that on Tuesdays he read to the kindergartners at the elementary school down the street, and that one little girl named Maya always sat in his lap because she said his cardigan was soft. He asked me if I had any children. I told him I had 2. He asked if they would come visit. I told him yes. He told me he had wanted for a long time to be an uncle. I want to give you one moment from that hour because I think about it often. About 30 minutes in, Stephen got very quiet. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. Then he looked up at me and he said, in a voice that was suddenly the voice of a careful and frightened adult and not the careful brother of a child, "Diane, is Mark going to be in trouble? For not telling you." I looked at Mark, who was sitting across the room pretending to read a magazine and clearly listening to every word. I looked back at Stephen. I said, "Stephen, Mark is not in trouble. Mark made a mistake. Mark and I are going to figure out the mistake together. But you are not part of the mistake. You are part of what was good in Mark's life that I am going to get to know now." Stephen thought about this for a long second. He said, "I told him for 12 years that he should tell you. I am not very good at convincing people of things. I am sorry I was not better at convincing him, Diane." I put my hand on top of his hand on the table. I did not say anything. He let his hand stay where it was. After a minute, he showed me the cardinal in the window. The conversation went on, but I have since then thought about that sentence. I told him for 12 years that he should tell you, and about the fact that the person in my husband's life who had been advocating most clearly for over a decade for me to know about him was the person I had been told was dead. I drove home that afternoon with Mark in the passenger seat, and I held his hand the entire way. He did not let go of my hand for 2 hours. We did not speak much. There was not in that car anything that needed to be spoken. We told the kids together, 2 weeks later, at the same kitchen table where Eliza had asked her question. We told them that Daddy had a brother named Stephen who lived in a special house in town because his brain worked differently than most people's brains, and that Daddy had been visiting him every other Thursday since before they were born, and that he was a kind, gentle man who loved birds and painted and read to little kids on Tuesdays. We told them we were sorry we had not told them sooner. We told them that the reason we had not told them sooner was a complicated grown-up reason that Mommy and Daddy were sorry about, and that they would understand more about when they were older. Eliza listened with the serious face she uses for important things. She thought about it for a minute. Then she said, "Is he the boy at the mall?" Mark said, "Yes, sweetheart, that was Stephen. He's a grown-up, but he's a grown-up who likes to hold his big brother's hand." Eliza nodded. She said, "Can I meet him?" Mark said, "Soon, sweetheart, very soon." Theo, who is 5, asked if Stephen had a dog. He did not. Theo said he would like to give Stephen a stuffed dog. He brought one to Maple Lane next weekend. Stephen, who Patricia later told me had cried for an hour after the kids left, named the dog Theo's dog and kept it on his pillow. The picnic was a year later, in the small park behind Maple Lane, on a Saturday in April. Patricia had organized it, an annual event for residents and their families. There were maybe 20 people there. Stephen was wearing the cardigan he always wore for important occasions. Mark and I had brought a strawberry cake. The kids had brought paintings they had made for Stephen. The day was warm enough that the kids had taken their jackets off and run around in t-shirts, the way kids do in a Vermont April when the sun finally arrives and forgets to leave. At one point, Eliza, who was 9 by then, walked across the grass to where Stephen was sitting on a bench. She did not say anything. She climbed up on the bench next to him. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the way she had been leaning her head against my shoulder since she was 4 years old, and she sat there in silence for about 30 seconds. Stephen, who was not used to being touched by children other than the kindergartners on Tuesdays, and who had been carefully maintaining the small, precise distance with our children that he had been taught was appropriate, did not know, I think, what to do at first. He looked at Mark across the picnic table with a confused alarm. Mark looked back at him with the small, steady nod that brothers give brothers. Stephen, very slowly, put his arm around Eliza's shoulders. Then he cried. Stephen cried in the warm April light on a wooden bench in a small park behind a residential facility, with his 9-year-old niece's head against his shoulder, in a way I had not seen a person cry before. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady and quiet and astonished, the way a person cries when he is 40 years old and has been waiting since he was 16 for someone to lean against him on a Saturday afternoon, as if leaning against him were the most ordinary thing in the world. Mark stood up from the picnic table. He walked across the grass. He sat down on the other side of Stephen. He put his arm around his brother's shoulders. Eliza did not move. Theo, who had been chasing a butterfly across the lawn, looked at the bench and decided, in the small wisdom of 5-year-olds, not to come over. He kept chasing the butterfly. The 3 of them sat on the bench for a long time. I sat at the picnic table by myself, and I watched them. And I made my peace with the 12 years I had not known about a brother named Stephen, and with the next 20 I was going to know about him, and with the fact that the best things you get to do as a wife and a mother are often the things you did not know you were going to get to do at all. Patricia walked over to the picnic table after a few minutes. She sat down across from me with a paper cup of coffee. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, very quietly, "Mrs. Holloway, I have been working at this facility for 19 years. I have seen exactly 4 moments like the one on that bench in 19 years. 4. I want you to know that. Whatever shape your marriage takes from here on out, whatever shape it takes, however hard it gets, what you did by walking in here a year ago and asking to meet him will keep being a true thing about you for the rest of Stephen's life. I just wanted to say that out loud, so it's said. She got up. She walked away. She is a woman who is good at saying the thing and then leaving, the way the best witnesses are. I did not see her again that afternoon. I did not need to. The thing was said. I want to tell you what I think about, 2 years later, when I think about the question Eliza asked at the breakfast table. I think about how the truth of a marriage can sit, for a decade, in a small 2-story house on the south side of a city you both live in, half an hour from your kitchen, behind a green and white sign that has been visible to anyone who happened to drive down Maple Lane on any random Thursday afternoon for 14 years. It was not hidden. It was unseen. There is a difference. Mark did not bury Stephen. He just did not point at him. I think about how easy it is in a long marriage to mistake the absence of contradictions for the presence of full knowledge. For 12 years, nothing Mark told me had ever turned out to be wrong. I had taken that as evidence of how much I knew about my husband. The actual evidence was much thinner. The actual evidence was only that nothing Mark told me had ever turned out to be wrong. The things Mark did not tell me were not in that evidence. They were in a different file altogether. The file of things I had not asked about, because I had no reason to ask about them, because I had been told from the third date forward that those things did not exist. I think about my father-in-law, who I never met, and about the sentence he wrote in a will that he intended to be the final word he ever gave my husband. I think about the strange power of a single sentence written by a dying man in a lawyer's office in Buffalo to shape the architecture of a marriage 3 states away and 12 years later. I do not believe in ghosts. I do believe in sentences. The most dangerous sentences are the ones that someone you loved said to you when you were young, that you carried because you could not let them go, that you tried to honor by becoming a man with locked rooms in your own house. Mark is in therapy now. He has been for a year and a half. He is, as he puts it, doing the work of figuring out what I owe my father, and what I owed myself, and what I owed Stephen, and what I owed you, and how the math went so badly wrong for so long. I am proud of him. I am also a different woman than I was at the breakfast table in March, and I have made my own peace with that. The marriage is not the same one we had. It is more honest. It is also a little quieter, because both of us know now what kind of silence can sit inside a kitchen for 12 years without anyone noticing. If this story landed for you, drop the word brother in the comments below. I read them. It tells me which stories are worth telling next. Subscribe for new stories, real patterns, full narratives, the long game. 2 small pieces of wisdom from this one before I go. First, when a child asks you a question, listen all the way to the end. 8-year-olds are the most reliable witnesses in your house. They have not yet learned to look away from things that do not match. The information arrives in their casual sentences between the cereal box and the dinosaur drawing, and the only thing required of you is to be the kind of adult who can hear it without flinching. Second, the most dangerous sentence you can be told about another person's life is, "There is nothing to say about that." There is always something to say. The fact that someone has decided not to say it is information. Keep the information in a file you check sometimes. The file is rarely empty. It is just locked, for reasons that will eventually become the rooms you have to walk into together when the time comes. Until we meet again, be gentle with yourself.